everyone. In this video, I'll be discussing about the cognitive view of learning. But before that, the following are the objectives of this discussion. Number 1, you will be able to define learning according to the cognitive theory. And number 2, you will be able to describe the information processing model. So what is the cognitive view of how we learn? Behavioral learning theories define learning as a relatively enduring change in observable behavior that occurs as a result of the interaction of an individual with the environment. The focus on behavioral learning theories is on producing desirable behavior or reducing undesirable behavior. The limitation of their study is that they neglect the need to understand the learner's mental processes. Educational psychologists became frustrated with the limitation of the behaviorist theories and methods, which could not explain the complexities of human cognition. This frustration, combined with the emergence of computer, gave rise to cognitive psychology and cognitive views of learning. It was since the late 1950s that launched the development of cognitive approaches to learning. So cognitive theory defines learning as a relatively enduring change in mental structure that occurs as a result of the interaction of an individual with the environment. Cognitive views of learning is characterized by their focus on the changes in thought that are involved in learning. They emphasize the mental processes underlying the processing of new information. Unlike behaviorists, cognitive psychologists argue that learning takes place in the mind. So, aside from the differences between the definition of learning and their focus of their study, individual differences is the comparison between these two theories. According to the cognitive theory, different individuals will construct different understanding even when they interact with identical environment. Unlike in behaviorist views of learning, individual differences play a fundamental role in helping teachers understand how and what each individual students may learn. For behaviorists, individual differences only reflect differences in students' past conditioning, reinforcement, and punishment. They are not taken into consideration to understand new learning. Research methods is another comparison between these two theories. Behavioral psychologists attempted to derive general principles of learning by conducting controlled laboratory experiments with animals other than humans. On the other hand, cognitive psychologists have used a much wider range of research methods to study learning. Why is it important to compare and contrast different learning theories? It is important because the goal of the teaching profession is to promote learning. It is important that you have a theory of learning to guide your decisions about the type of instructional environment that you will need to create to reach this goal, the information processing model. In this section, we examine a model on how the mind processes information, which is a popular cognitive approach on understanding how people acquire, store, and recall new information. A model is a human-made, concrete representation of a complex system that can be used to guide the understanding of the real system that is being modeled. Models are typically useful when representing a phenomenon that is invisible to our eyes or that is hard to visualize. The model that I was talking about was the information processing model. It is a classical model used by the cognitive psychologists to explain cognition and learning. Why is it called information processing model? The name comes from using the computer as a metaphor to understand the human mind. The human mind is analogous to a computer in that new information can be processed, stored, and retrieved later. So the sensory memory system is the first system in the information processing model. The sensory memory system is what first comes in contact with the external environment. This memory system is composed of a set of registers for each human sense, for the visual, auditory, tactile, and olfactory. The function of each sensory register is to hold the information from the environment in its raw or unprocessed form. In other words, images, sounds, smells, and any other environmental stimuli are being registered by our senses but we have not yet consciously processed these stimuli for meaning. The sensory memory is the information store that briefly holds stimuli from the environment until they can be processed. Cognitive psychologists argue that everything that our body senses is stored in sensory memory, which means that sensory memory has a very large capacity. However, research shows that once the stimuli are removed, they remain in the corresponding register only for a very brief period of time. In other words, we can hold any information that comes through our senses in the environment, but this unprocessed information is rapidly lost. Attention is defined as the process of allocating cognitive resources to a stimulus or task at hand. Attention is a selective process by nature because the amount of the cognitive resources in the brain are. So to answer this question, it is important to first distinguish between automatic and conscious processing. Automatic processing occurs when an individual has sufficiently practiced a procedure to allow for the procedure to happen with minimal use of his or her cognitive resources. Conscious processing, on the other hand, is extremely demanding of cognitive resources, and for this very reason will require full attention. Automatic processes, on the other hand, requires minimal attention only. Perception is defined as the cognitive processes that gives meaning to a sensory input. Once attention is devoted to certain stimuli, perception is the process that interprets the stimuli based on our prior knowledge or long-term memory. So take a look at this picture. What can you see? Some of you might say that the picture describes the image of a young woman, while some of you might say that it is the image of an old woman. Well, there is no right or wrong answer in describing that image. It would only describe that perception is subjective. In fact, research in perception shows that what we see, what we hear, smell, taste, and feel depends on our personal experiences and memories. Working memory is the second memory system of the information processing model and can be defined as the place where information is processed for meaning. Take note that information comes into working memory from two different directions. First, a portion of the information held in the sensory registers is moved to working memory after the cognitive process of attention and perception. Second, information held in long-term memory can be retrieved and stored in a working memory for further processing. The function of the visual-spatial sketchpad is to hold visual and spatial information for further processing. The phonological loop, or also known as articulatory loop, holds words and sounds for further functioning. The central executive is in charge of focusing attention, organizing new information, integrating new information with prior knowledge, controlling complex voluntary tasks, and inhibiting inappropriate thoughts and action. The visual-spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop are also called slave system because their function is to hold information for the central executive to manipulate. According to the research, adults are able to hold 7 plus or minus 2 unrelated bits of information in a working memory at any one time. This means that the range of working memory capacity is between 5 and 9 bits of information, depending on each individual. In addition to the capacity limitations, the duration of information processing model in working memory is also extremely limited, ranging from 15 to 30 seconds. In this section, we focus on 2 cognitive processes by which information gets from working memory into long-term memory, that is, storing and encoding. Storing is the cognitive process by which a copy of new information is saved into long-term memory, while encoding is the cognitive process by which new information is elaborated or organized and is saved into long-term memory. So to better understand the differences between storing and encoding new information, let's distinguish between rote learning and meaningful learning methods. So rote learning is the result of merely storing new information and can be achieved with rehearsal, repeating information over and over for a very long period of time, either mentally or aloud. A characteristic of rote learning methods is that how much you remember depends on how much time you spend practicing the information to be learned. The more you practice, the better you will be able to retrieve the practiced information from your long-term memory. Meaningful learning is more efficient than rote learning, especially when students can relate ideas to themselves. So there are two methods of encoding information in meaningful ways: elaboration and organization. With elaboration methods, students use their prior knowledge to expand on a new idea, thereby storing more information than what was originally presented to them. The second method for encoding information meaningfully is organization, which is most useful when the information to be encoded is complex and interrelated. While storing and encoding stores information from working memory into long-term memory, retrieval pulls information from long-term memory into working memory. Retrieval is the process that opposes to the process of storing and encoding. Retrieval can be conscious or automatic. An example of conscious retrieval happens when students are taking exam, because they need to consciously look for the information from long-term memory. Other times, retrieving information from long-term memory is automatic, such as when students remember regular classroom procedures, such as writing their name on the assignment without the need to be reminded. So a second distinction can be made between recognition and recall. Recognition is a form of retrieval that works by recognizing that what we have seen something before. This occurs in multiple choice tests, where students simply need to recognize a right answer from a set of distractors. Recall, on the other hand, is a form of retrieval that requires generating information without any cues. Responding to an open-ended easy question is an example of recall. Most students feel that recall is harder than recognition. So retrieval and knowledge activation. The mechanism at work when we retrieve information from long-term memory has been called the knowledge activation. Knowledge activation is the process of becoming aware of information in long-term memory and usually spread from one idea to other ideas that are related to the original ones. So if knowledge activation is not or does not find the information that we are trying to retrieve, we are either unable to find or come up with an answer, or we might come up with answering through knowledge reconstruction. So knowledge reconstruction is a mental process that uses the information we have stored in long-term memory to construct a reasonable answer. So an advantage of memory reconstruction is that students develop new understanding and skills by changing their mental structures over time. Also, the reconstructive memory is very efficient. Rather than remembering the entirety of a memory event, we only need to remember key elements of that event. Later, at retrieval, when key elements are being activated, we can put them together to reconstruct the event. Retrieval and forgetting. The information processing model assumes that part of the information held in sensory memory or in working memory or in long-term memory can be lost. So there are at least three theories to explain retrieval failure. So one theory argues that information might decay over time. We forget information when activation of the links connecting to the information does not happen for a long period of time. In other words, the use it or lose it effect. That is, forgetting happens when information is not used. This theory is called the decay theory of forgetting. The second theory argues that failure to retrieve information from long-term memory is the result of interference of the other information with the search of the target information. This can be explained by the cognitive views of learning. And finally, according to the cue-dependent theory, forgetting is caused by a lack of effective retrieval cues. Like for example, A student might fail to retrieve a fact for an exam even when he is certain that he knows the fact. This phenomenon is called tip of the tongue effect, or the TOT effect. The TOT effect is the feeling of knowing something that cannot be retrieved immediately.